past Halloween, so good evening. Right? And welcome to our monthly meeting of the New York Society for General Semantics. Those of you that were with us just 1 week ago, and we had a tremendous Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture given by Professor Terence P. Moran, and really a excellent symposium, Crazy Talk Stupid Symposium that followed, and of course that was hosted by the Institute of General Semantics and co-sponsored by the New York Society for General Semantics. And we, in the New York Society, do not require or ask you to pay any membership dues for all of our hospitality and fine events, but we do ask that you join as members of the Institute of General Semantics, for which you'll receive, among other things, a subscription to the journal, etc., which is the premier, is the only journal devoted to general semantics. And it really gives me great pleasure to introduce this program tonight, entitled Dark Nets and Disruptive Practices. And the star of our show, Thom Gencarelli, last year received the high honor from the New York State Communication Association of receiving the John F. Wilson Award, which was based on his record of scholarship and service. And I want to mention that other scholars that have been named as John F. Wilson Fellows include Neil Postman, a name known to some folks in general semantic circles, Gary Gumpert, Dan Hahn, who was a great scholar of political rhetoric, Deborah Borisoff, Susan Drucker, who participated in some of our previous events here, James W. Carey, a brilliant scholar of journalism and media, Susan Barnes, Brian Cogan, who's sitting in the peanut gallery. Wave, Brian. Hi, Brian.
Send more peanuts.
And yours truly. And as part of that deal of being named a Wilson Fellow, he's asked in the following year to deliver a John F. Wilson Fellow lecture, which he did at the New York State Communication Association's annual meeting back on October 13th, which, by the way, was the 75th anniversary of NYSGS, as we called it, and NYSGS and IGS was among the supporters of that conference. And that gave us the title of our program, the title of his talk, Dark Nets and Disruptive Practices. So we thought such a wonderful lecture really bears repeating. And so we wanted to share it again tonight with our NYSGS crowd because it really is worthwhile. And just to read the little blurb about the lecture. I think you wrote this, Tom?
Someone.
Yeah, someone did, probably Tom. All too often, people outside the academic discipline of communication and media studies consider what we do to be little more than a special interest, rather than the study of something that is central to and one of the primary defining features of the human experience. As a case in point, the presidential election of 2016, the most disruptive event of all disruptive events in our contemporary experience in the US, can be explained from a media perspective, and an historical one at that, beginning from Gutenberg's invention of the mechanical movable type printing press, and through our contemporary innovations in mobility, social media, and Tor. Is that movie that's Ragnarok? Or no, Tor. Tor, T-O-R. This presentation this presentation argues that all inventions and innovations in media are a disruption, and that the evolution of media by which the citizenry in a democratic society inform themselves can explain in full exactly what happened to us in 2016. So we invited Thom to reprise his lecture here with us tonight, but that's not all. That's not enough. So following the lecture, as an added bonus special for the New York Society for General Semantics, additional reflections, comments, and responses will be delivered by three of us: M.J. Robinson, who is Professor of New Media and Journalism and Media Studies, and Bernard N. Stern Professor of Humor, and Graduate Deputy Chair for the Media Studies MS program in the Department of Television and Radio at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. So wow. MJ, yes, it is wow. MJ yes, will be the first to give her reflections. She'll be followed by Michael Plugh, who is Thom's colleague, so he may be a little constrained about what he says. But nope. Probably not. He has no boundaries. Michael Plugh is Professor of Communication at Manhattan College. He is immediate past president of the New York State Communication Association, and he's an internet officer and executive board member of the Media Ecology Association. And lastly, I'll go, you know me, Lance Strate, Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University. I'm also past president of the New York State Communication Association, a executive board member of the Media Ecology Association, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Institute of General Semantics, and your president of the New York Society for General Semantics. But of course, the main attraction for tonight is Thom Gencarelli, who received his PhD in 1993 from NYU, studying with Neil Postman and company and the Media Ecology program. Thom is professor and the founding chair of the Communication Department at Manhattan College in Riverdale. You have to say it right, Riverdale, New York. You do good? Yeah. Yeah. He's a past president as well of the New York State Communication Association. Can't get enough of us. He is a past president of the Media Ecology Association. He has twice been past president of the New Jersey Communication Association and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Institute of General Semantics. He researches and writes about media literacy, media education, media ecology, and popular media and culture, with an emphasis on popular music. And he's the co-editor with Brian Cogan, who I mentioned before. Wave again, Brian. of the book entitled Baby Boomers and Popular Culture, an Inquiry into America's Most Popular Generation. And Thom is also currently at work on a book about language acquisition and cognitive development. I should mention that Thom is also a songwriter, music producer, singer and guitar player, and he's released 2 album-length works with his group called Blue Race. It's one word, but it's Blue Race. I don't know why, but the first album was called World is Ready, the second Beautiful Sky, and there's a third in the works, which is it still Untitled? Which is due out next year. And Thom sadly did not bring any of his CDs for sale, but they can be purchased
everywhere that music is sold on the internet. Not that anyone buys music anymore.
Are you going to give us a sample?
Yeah, so so he's going to sing his talk.
Did you bring your roller skates?
No.
Yeah, but certainly look up Blue Race, one word, and buy those CDs and make Thom happy. And so it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Thom Gencarelli.
And Sophia Ixnay on the Blu-rays. So first, I'd like to thank Lance and the New York Society for General Semantics for inviting me to revisit and to represent this talk here tonight. Lance, as he said, has already heard a version of it, and I don't think that he would have invited me and thereby subjected himself to having to listen to this all again if he didn't think I had something worth saying to you. So hopefully I do. The talk is really a synthesis of my thinking as a media ecologist, as a media educationist, and as someone who came rather late in the game to a concern with journalism. With respect to my title, full disclosure, Dark Nets and Disruptive Practices, I'm actually going to start with the disruptive practices part. It was kind of like when I was working on this, the title was kind of like peanut butter and jelly. You just can't say it the other way. It didn't sound right. So I'm going to talk about the disruptive practices part first, and then I'll get us eventually, soon enough, I hope, to the dark networks part. And so let me begin by telling you this. The terms disruptive technology, and disruptive innovation, and the disruptive economy entered the lexicon by way of an article in the Harvard Business Review back in 1995 by Joseph Bauer and Clayton M. Christensen. The article was entitled Disruptive Technologies, Catching the Wave. And the terms subsequently became both industrial and culturally important and influential upon the publication of Christensen's 1997 book entitled The Innovator's Dilemma, which was, by the way, also published by Harvard University Press, where Christensen is a faculty member. These ideas have permeated the insular and myopic world of Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley ever since, among venture capitalists and angel investors, and among all of the tech-oriented grads of Stanford, Caltech, Berkeley, Harvard, MIT, and the like, whose goal is to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, or Jeff Bezos, or Mark Andreessen. To be clear, the primary motive of most of the people who inhabit and drive this world within our world isn't to provide for the greater social good by creating for us devices, platforms, and applications with social utility that we might even say we need. Ever since the success of Microsoft and Apple, young men, and I say men deliberately and with great emphasis, young men who might have previously decided to become, physicians, have either gone on to work for or to develop tech startups, or have gravitated toward that other great disruptive innovation within the financial services industry, in which we call the hedge fund. The two of those are inextricably linked is a story for another day. And so when we think of the obvious disruptive innovations that fall from the tips of our collective tongues, like Airbnb and Uber, we're all aware of the promotional spin. That is how they provide opportunities for people to make a living, and convenience and low prices for the rest of us. Maybe, by the way, you've paid attention over the past few weeks, and in this regard, to the fiery crash and burn of the ill-conceived, or borrowing from the Beastie Boys, the ill-communicated startup Bodega. Yeah. What all of this marketing and promotion and pitch language covers up, though, is that the guys who write the code, along with the relatively small numbers of people who work for them, and who then attach it to the code for a secure credit card transaction, and thereby, by the way, have access to the rest of your digital history and record, they're not really interested in anything other than that, in you finding convenience and coolness in it, and as a result, in the vast sums of money that they'll make with minimal work and effort once we all have the app installed in our phones. Uber does not want to have employees and pay benefits and have to worry about things like people calling in sick and bargaining for their collective rights. They don't want to own cars. They don't want to pay to maintain them and gas them up and insure them. In fact, I'm still a bit curious in this regard why their chief competitor, Lyft, is working with General Motors to develop self-driving cars. I don't think I'm overstating the case. I think that I'm deconstructing the spin when I say that they just want to sit back and let the program and the algorithm do the work while they accumulate wealth and stock options from this newfangled business model and buy startups and competitors and other tech companies that will help them both expand and protect their franchise. And of course, this is understandable in a world of extravagant expectations and ambitions, under an ideology that is anti-union and thus anti-worker, and in a government and business climate that's been, since the late 1970s in the Carter administration, anti-regulation in order to stimulate growth of industries and new industries, and without consideration to what those industries do, how many people they employ, and what those positions pay as a living wage. We should all be entrepreneurs. Even our own institutions, as academics, expect us to behave in entrepreneurial ways these days. All of this said, what I want to point out about disruptive practices is simply this, and it was in what Lance said in remarking about my abstract. When we're talking about inventions and innovations in communication and media, all technologies are disruptive. At least they have been since Gutenberg's invention of his mechanical movable type printing press in the 15th century. And at least they are when and if they succeed. Right? I don't know if any of you have 8-track tape players at this point, or CD-ROM machines. New media technologies, both hardware and software, introduced as industrial practice, do not simply add to what we do or change our previous ways of doing things. They change everything. They change the way we live our lives to the extent that we can say they change the very definition of what it means to be human. They change the trajectory of our culture, of our civilization. In a world that is, interestingly enough, not always culturally progressive, but which is exceedingly welcoming of technological progress, this change also occurs because the culture at large is not only predisposed and quick to accept it, and quick to part with our money, but because we, by and large, do not question it. And so the purpose of my talk is, in the next half hour, 35 minutes, just to keep you on track, is to walk us through a brief history of the disruptive media practices that have brought us here in the United States to what, as Lance again said, is, as I said, is one of the most disruptive events in our recent history, the 2016 presidential campaign and election. I might also say that these practices have, given globalization and the global economy and our global village, that they've brought about the rise of authoritarianism and far-right movements in a number of countries in the West and the Northern Hemisphere. I'm not saying that these practices have caused this turn of events, but I am saying that they've fed into and fanned the flames of divisiveness, intolerance, hatred, and that they've swelled the tendency toward illiberal and uninformed, or maybe better, badly informed thinking. And so let's begin with Gutenberg's invention. With respect to my argument, the disruption of the mechanical movable type printing press is twofold. Elizabeth Eisenstein, in her tremendously important book, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, gives attention to the fact that this first technology of mass communication ushered in an age in which communication first becomes an industry. However, this disruption from an age in which communication was not industrial to an age in which it is, does not seem to trouble Eisenstein much. And of course, this is because she is a dispassionate historian whose aim is to retell and report and to describe and to explain, not to pass judgment. However, the fact that the communications that would derive from this device would forevermore be guided, if not shaped, by a commercial imperative is, to put it mildly, a disruption worth noting. The second disruption of print is that it brought about the potential for a democratic or a mass literacy. As books became a commodity and became affordable and acquirable, and as we pass through the time that Eisenstein refers to as the incunabula, or the cradle period of the invention, where its consequences begin to take hold but were not yet fully realized. And as an affluent merchant class rose up alongside the nobility, more and more people were given the opportunity, the gift, that is to become literate. But I would argue that since this time, mass literacy has never really, truly been realized. That the literate in any culture, any country, any sovereign territory, in any time, have always been a minority, an elite. I part ways here with my late great teacher Neil Postman, who in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death romanticized and I would say even exaggerated the extent to which the citizenry at the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates were more literate than the citizenry of our contemporary culture in our post-literate age. Maybe the attendees to the debates were attuned to a literate mode of thinking and oration, but what about those folks who stayed home? What about those who did not participate in the workings of their representative democracy even then? Simply put, and you all know this, literacy is hard work. It is an unnatural practice to sit in silent, uninterrupted concentration and do the wholly active and attentive mind work that is turning black marks on a page, and now on a screen, into meaning. Mark by mark, word after word, sentence by sentence, left to right, scanning down the page. As a result, it therefore becomes an acquired practice only among those of us who are willing to sit still and do this work, and who develop the patience to stick with it, to delay gratification and delay the achievement, the final full outcome that is having read something from beginning to end. And so while information and access to it is power, while knowledge is power, and while literacy is the ultimate set of keys to this kingdom, and while a consequence of the printing press is to dangle those keys in the reach of everyone, not everyone chooses to grab a hold of them. This has always been the case. I'll also suggest that Gutenberg's invention brought about another, albeit indirect disruption, which began because of its role bringing us back from the darkness and into the light. Of course, what I mean is the following. The printing press led to the Great Schism, the Protestant Reformation, or I'll say it this way, the Protestant Reformation. As a result of the printing and widespread distribution of Martin Luther's screed against the corruption of the Holy Roman Church. By the way, we just celebrated the anniversary just this week. The resulting decline in the church's power and dominance accompanied the release from libraries in monasteries across Europe, the great works that had come down to us from Greece and Rome. And on the one hand, we can criticize the medieval church for their control and their sealing away knowledge in the name of the idea that reason is antithetical to faith. On the other hand, though, it's important to recognize and credit the church for preserving for us over the centuries the very foundations, right? This very blueprint of our Western civilization. The release brought about the Enlightenment, a return to a free reign of ideas based upon the practice wherein, to borrow Newton's words, we stand upon the shoulders of giants, and wherein in moving knowledge onward and upward and based upon our close and careful reading of their contributions, we go on and make contributions of our own. And of course, all of this can be considered disruption. But the particular and indirect disruption that matters to my argument has to do with a specific group of Enlightenment thinkers, the founding fathers of our great experiment in democracy on these shores, and through whom we moved the concept and practice of democracy beyond the Athenian ideal. Like all political philosophies and theories put to practice, ours is far from a perfect system. Not only did the founding fathers exclude women from participation in their conception of democracy, they excluded their slaves, who they not only did not consider equal, but considered to be 3/5 men. In addition, they devised a voting system with an electoral college because they did not, at base, trust the mob. They did not believe a citizenry was capable of, or ought to be allowed to, make the ultimate decision about power. And so it is in this context and on these shores that the next disruptive communication technology arises, the roots of what will eventually become the newspaper. Now, I realize there's a parallel history of newspapers in Europe at the time. However, the history of the newspaper in the US is particularly telling, and not merely because it'll help me make my case. This history begins with political pamphlets for landowners, who clearly had a vested interest in their governance as it affected their lives and livelihoods, and who were close to power. Significantly, however, we very early on developed a political system that, with certain twists and turns, became a system of two parties, two sides. We developed a system that leads to what we call, in general semantics terms, either-or thinking, if, that is, it leads to thinking at all and not just the taking of sides. This is particularly significant given that our US Constitution became a model for the rise of other democratic societies in the West, most of which, however, have chosen to follow a parliamentary model with multiple parties advocating for multiple social and civic stances on behalf of a multiplicity of peoples. In fact, the long-standing and blatant ideology of European newspapers in contrast to ours and our supposed objectivity reflects the pillar-like structure of so many of these Western European societies. But so how did we in the US end up striving toward objectivity in the promulgation of news? The reason has to do with yet another disruptive technology that arrived in the midst of the 19th century, the invention of the telegraph by Samuel Finley Rees Morse. The relationship of the telegraph to newspapers and objectivity is this. The telegraph provided us with a means to instantaneously transmit news from around the country and, in fact, the world. In turn, the broadsheet or city daily newspapers of the time collectively looked upon this invention with great envy. But they soon discovered that it was not something that they could afford on an individual basis. This led to the establishment of the first wire service, the Associated Press, which became the clearinghouse for the collection of nationwide news to be provided to any and all client newspapers that chose to subscribe to its service. Given that these newspapers were slanted to begin with, and in order to satisfy all of them with this new service, the AP provided them with just the facts. This became the seeds of the practice and the idea of objectivity in news. Before this, however, and forgive me for suddenly going out of historical and chronological order, another disruptive technology within the newspaper business also arose during the first half of the 19th century. In 1833, here in New York, Benjamin Day, the publisher of the New York Sun, hit upon an innovation that would forever change the nature of the provision of news. An innovation that harkens back to my point about Gutenberg's invention, ushering in an age in which the commercial imperative would change the shape and nature of our messages forevermore, at least in capitalist societies with a commercial system of media. Day created the penny press. Now, the penny press turns the idea of news on its head. The previous idea was that all materials printed for people's edification, entertainment, and pleasure, think about the development of literature and the novel during the same time. All of this contained ideas or art that was inherently important and valuable. That this is why it was worthwhile to purchase a book or a pamphlet or now a newspaper. Day's disruption was the innovation, the realization that people as readers have a value. That if he reduced the price of his publication to make it affordable to everyone, even if what he charged them did not cover the cost of production and distribution, he could bring in revenue and earn himself a tidy profit through a different means, by selling the attentions of all of these readers to the producers of goods and services, who would now be able to reach them all easily and simultaneously with their sales pitch. To make this work, however, to make it a success, Day needed to ensure that enough readers had enough incentive to fork over their hard-earned pennies. Thus, in his attempt to ensure such an incentive for readers of modest means, he shifted the focus from what should get attention to what he believed would get attention. The sum of these two disruptions, then, the telegraph and the penny press, laid the foundation for the modern newspaper industry and its practices up through television and until the recent disruption of the internet. The telegraph turned news from something that happened recently into something that happened yesterday or even today. The penny press brought about the sensationalism and yellow journalism of Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World, and the tabloid papers of today, like the New York Daily News and the New York Post. It also, however, introduced a new business model even for serious newspapers, the offspring of the political pamphlet, and thus created a schism within the newspaper industry. The growth of city dailies, broadsheets in most major cities in the US was epitomized by the inaugural publication of the New York Times in 1851. In contrast to sensationalist newspapers, the franchise for these papers was and continues to be the credibility, veracity, and in-depth analysis of their reporting. However, the schism also created a high versus low culture, right? An elite versus mass industry, with the print edition of the New York Times to this day catering to people of great affluence by running ads on pages 2 and 3 for retailers like Chanel and Tiffany and places I don't shop, all the while maintaining a reputation as the paper of record. The next disruption is the invention of radio and the arrival of broadcasting in the 1920s with the establishment of a radio industry, of NBC's 2 radio networks, and of the CBS. In the interest of time, though, I'll simply remind you that this disruption led directly to what we call the press-radio war, which lasted from 1933 to 1935. The war was, of course, predicated by the threat to the old medium in the face of the new. Why would people want to read the news when they can just listen to it on the radio? Why do that hard work of turning black marks on a page into meaning when this new age of secondary orality ushered in by radio relieves us of the need to work so hard? We do not need to listen, but we certainly cannot close our ears. Well, in response to this, I'll just say that this disruption was nothing compared to the disruption that followed, the introduction of television. It is television news that begins the shift wherein whatever we had been able to do before to engender serious journalistic practice and to create great journalism begins to break down, to become problematic, to become debased. The beginnings of television news entailed 10 and 15-minute news breaks across the various parts of the day. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that the 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, began their nightly 30-minute news broadcasts. CBS was first in 1963 with Walter Cronkite as anchor, turning into the man most trusted to tell us what we needed to know about our world and all things in it that day. And while the coverage of John F. Kennedy's assassination established how important television can be in galvanizing the attention of people over a shared national tragedy or event, this also represents the time at which research begins to present a figure that would remain constant throughout the remainder of the 20th century. That 3/4 of people in the United States get most, if not all, of their news from television. This figure remains almost the same today, even in our age of the internet and social media, and updates from just 5 minutes ago. Lance talks about this a little bit in his book, Amazing Ourselves to Death. The reasons why are obvious. Reading is hard. People are too busy to find the time to read a newspaper, but can sit back and watch 30 minutes of news at the end of their day and feel that they've done the important job of informing themselves. And of course, the immediate question becomes, what can you learn? What can you know from watching and listening to 30 minutes of news that is actually only 22 minutes or so with the commercial breaks? And then over time, things begin to get even weirder. Television news becomes just another show, designed to attract ratings, but among an audience who pat themselves on the back because they believe they're watching programming that is good for them instead of reruns of Gilligan's Island. Local news arises to fill the early fringe day part before network news, and consultants turn it into happy news with elaborate opens with music, with a team of announcers who tell jokes and wish each other happy birthday on the air, with sportscasters and weather men who become the local market celebrity, and all the like. The visual imperative of the medium eventually comes to the fore, and the question, what can we show, becomes a, if not the, driving production value in the editorial decision-making process about what stories to cover. And then in the early to mid-1970s, salespeople begin knocking on doors in affluent suburban communities and asking people if they would be interested to pay for something they previously got for free: television. One of the earliest channels in the augmented service that cable provides us is what was often referred to back in that day as the Chicken Noodle Network, CNN. And in the beginning, CNN operated like an around-the-clock news operation with 24/7 news coverage. However, this is in part because there was no competition. And people, including people in the industry, thought it was all kind of folly anyway. No one anticipated the next great national event that would galvanize a nation and make them want to watch. And this came with the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Suddenly CNN, a dedicated news channel, could cover this story while the broadcast networks that had reigned supreme in covering news prior to this all had to preempt their regular programming to cover the ongoing story, hemorrhaging money in the process. And, by the way, even retransmitting CNN's feed. Of course, it did not help the broadcast networks when Larry Tisch bought the CBS from William Paley in 1980 and learned from Paley that CBS' vaunted news division was a lost leader supported by the entertainment division. Tisch reportedly told Paley, "I'm a businessman, and where I come from, no division or department loses money and is propped up by other divisions and departments." This idea that broadcast television news would forevermore be a profit center for networks was the death knell. Larry Tisch simply did not understand the television business. Nonetheless, the real disruption in television news, and for this generation at this time, comes in 1996 when CNN comes face to face with the disruptive competition that is the Fox News Channel. Fox, with its fair and balanced and we report, you decide slogans, is a network that, all spin aside, was conceived as a counter to the left-leaning bias of television news. Now, where this idea of a left-leaning liberal bias comes from, I might add, is veiled anti-Semitism from white Midwestern Christian men and their belief and concern that Jews control the media industry and the business of news. The question of bias in the presentation of news, newspaper or television, is an assignment that I love to give my students. Show me the evidence. However, this competition between CNN and Fox does not itself come to a fevered pitch. It's mostly a battle for numbers, like cost per thousand, until MSNBC, the third lowest rated cable satellite telco network, long abandoned as a viable project by Microsoft, makes the move in and around 2010 to become the left-of-center foil to the Fox News Channel. If the creation of the Fox News Channel was not itself disruption enough to sow the seeds of division in the viewing audience, which I remind you is supposed to be people seeking out information, this move on the part of MSNBC, which was solely a business proposition intended to lure viewers away from CNN and in so doing build MSNBC's revenue and franchise, now provided us with the kind of division that producers of talking heads television love and always seek to incite. Find two people on polar opposite sides of an issue and have them yell at and interrupt each other and stir up as much of a spectacle as they can. This is what talk-based television bombards us with every day as the model for serious and significant discourse in our contemporary age. And it is in this semantic environment in which the 2016 campaign and election was conducted and played out. But wait, stop the presses. I'm not finished yet. What about the internet and the introduction of what was originally called Web 2.0 and which are now social media as disruptive innovations? What about this dark net stuff? With respect to the internet, specifically, let me offer two significant disruptions I see as having taken place with respect to our attempts to inform ourselves and with respect to professional editors, reporters, and producers' attempts to inform us, and with respect to other not-so-professional editors, reporters, and producers' attempts to influence us. The first of these is that one of the great things about our internet portals, and this now includes social media as portals, is that they offer us access to periodicals and sites to which we would not otherwise have access. I have a digital subscription to the New York Times. However, I read and take advantage of multiple periodicals and sites every day. But this comes at a cost. We don't pay for this access. The cost of internet service provision and our mobile ISP does not include any portion of funds allocated to the provision of this information. Apple News and Google News and Yahoo and Facebook do not pay licensing to the sites and sources they make available to us. This is a problem for a professional industry that so desperately needs people who are willing to dedicate themselves to the critically important work that is investigative reporting, and on our behalf, holding the powerful, elected, appointed, and otherwise, to account. Where have all the financial underpinnings gone, and is it possible to resurrect or to reinvent them? Second, according to my most recent look at the figures, as of January 2017, the website techeye.uk capped the number of individual websites on the internet at over 1.8 billion. And according to Caitlin Dewey of the Washington Post, by 2015, the total number of web pages was estimated to be 47 billion, and of course climbing. The indexed web, the web that you can search via Google, contains over 4.6 billion pages. I bring this up as a point of comparison, right? Interpersonal communication, me talking to you, is point-to-point communication. Mass communication is communication from points, right? From the big companies to all of us. Is internet communication multi-point to multi-point? And if so, how might one navigate, much less try to make sense of such an unfathomably large information ecosystem? The fact is we do not, we cannot. As TechEye also suggested, roughly only 1 million sites generate 50% of internet traffic. Nielsen estimated in 2013 that the average person does not venture very far across the web, only visiting about 96 separate domains per month. But let's think about this from the other side for a moment, from the production side. The side that is the man behind the curtain, as I often say to my students. With respect to the provision of news, the internet was very quickly colonized by the major corporations who had a stake in and produced and provided news before the internet. At first, they entered into the internet business simply to hold a place for themselves. They simply repositioned what they had been doing on paper and on their channels before this. But since that time, it's become a fight for them to determine how to monetize that position and to guesstimate whether and or if convergence will lead us to a post-hard copy, screen delivery only world. In the meantime, new internet-only entities arose to challenge their hegemony and their role and responsibility. But here two important questions arise. The first is, how do these new internet-only properties monetize their own operations in order to, as I said, sufficiently remunerate those people who are willing to dedicate their lives to the essential work that is investigative reporting on our behalf and holding the powerful, elected, appointed, and otherwise to account? The second question is, how do they cut through the clutter of 1.8 billion websites and 4.6 billion index pages in order to do this? Obviously, one answer is through pretend credibility, like the Huffington Post, which in its name sounds like a newspaper. In addition, out of this clutter has also arisen the dark stuff. Sites that are not created, that do not exist to challenge the hegemony of traditional or mainstream news agencies. And by the way, I remind you that mainstream is not an epithet. not even in discourse about media convergence among people in our discipline of communication and media studies. These news sites are designed to take sides, to sow discord and divisiveness, and to propagandize rather than to serve as platforms to collect, analyze, interpret, and report on the news of the day. The ultimate rise and profile of these kinds of sites has been enabled by the last disruption I have time to talk about here today, and that is social media. I'm almost finished. The problem of social media's role in the provision of news and information is, as I see it, a matter of three matters. And if Facebook, the first great and lasting social media platform, and the biggest came to the fore in 2006, we might say that our social media environment had reached its decade mark in conjunction with the 2016 presidential campaign. First, social media are defined perhaps more than anything else by one characteristic. They are comprised of user-generated content. Yes, that's right. We provide our content free of charge to these providers, to these platforms and applications, so that they can make a profit mainly by selling advertising back to us. But another definition speaks to another mantra of the media industry since the last half of the 20th century: interactivity. Well, interactivity sounds as though we're all doing something rather than, say, sitting back and passively watching reality-based television. The industrial ideal of interactivity, the disruption of it, has always been to create a two-way channel to advertise directly to us as individuals rather than as members of a mass market or of a particular demographic. And now we all willingly, happily, and freely give away information about ourselves so that marketers can profile us and use that information to target us and what they know about us. Importantly, people caught up within the social media environment, and that's more and more seeming like pretty much everybody, pursue this mantle of generating content and interacting as though what we create and what we put out matters. And in doing so, we've unleashed the mob. We have given the mob a platform. We've given the mob a sense of scale, a credibility, a voice, a significance with respect to influence where one really doesn't or shouldn't exist. In the worst case scenario that happens every day now, individuals speak their voice as media, right, prod users, as prosumers, and share whatever messages support their views without examining sources, and often without even knowing how to do so or understanding why doing so is necessary and paramount. We also write to one another in threads that often turn out to be disjointed and jumbled, and wherein you might wonder why we spend so much time and energy and effort in the first place. My second point is about the blurring of the editorial and the advertising of social media. Although to talk about the traditional distinction between the two in a newspaper or a magazine seems absurd when we apply it to social media, unless and until we regard social media as the primary media by which people now seek to inform themselves. The disruptive shift here came when Facebook, and everyone else pretty much, shifted their interface from the computer laptop screen to the narrow vertical touch screen of a smartphone. Once there is no longer room for ads on the right-hand side of the page, Facebook folded their ads into their other innovation that they call the Newsfeed. And suddenly, as we scroll down the page and scroll and scroll and scroll, because after all that's what Facebook wants us to do, we encounter a feed comprised of posts by friends and advertising and other kinds of paid and promotional posts. But people also share because in the new social media ecosystem, to post is to be. And they share information and posts from questionable sources, including now bots, right? And what cannot be called anything other than advertorials. In the meantime, Facebook's algorithms are at work driving your attention based upon the sum total of your past clicks, your likes, your posts, your comments, etc. And the brain trust at Facebook suddenly wonders why they need to fend off concerns, amongst themselves too, about becoming a ministry of truth. Third, I have grave concerns about social media, and in particular, the disruptive innovation that is a media ecosystem mainly driven, mainly balanced by algorithms, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. My concern is this: as a media educator, I don't know how to best teach this. If, to use McLuhan's words, media studies has always been about making the invisible visible, with social media, we now have two distinct levels of what is invisible to people. The context that is social media, and how the interface of social media in general, but also the particular apps and the platforms we use, dictate and determine our behavior and our use. But underneath this is the architecture of programming, of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And while the metaphorical meaning of Doug Rushkoff's argument in Program or Be Programmed is not that we should all learn to become programmers, but that we cannot allow ourselves to be programmed, to be used, right? This has made media education both a more difficult, but also a more critically important endeavor than ever before. And so this then, and finally, gets us to the dark networks of my title. What I am referring to as dark nets have mainly arisen within the social media platforms that are Facebook, Alphabet's Google, and YouTube, and Twitter. And they have played out in terms of a use of fake accounts, of bots, of the manipulation of algorithms, and the purposeful blurring of the lines between advertising and other content. In addition, I'll just remark in passing that the sharing of the critically important work of professional news organizations, without licensing being paid for such sharing, is eating into the ability of these organizations to carry out their work, and that they are at the same time being replaced in part by these new internet-only entities that are themselves hard-pressed. So quickly, fake accounts are simple to create, they are difficult to police, and they are bought and sold on a secondary market for what is otherwise a free service. I have 3 Facebooks. Right, so much for 1.3 billion discrete users. In the meantime, the presence that is a user, right, participation, posting, and sharing, can be and is now often accomplished by bots, programs that are written once the account is established to perform these actions. Bot-driven accounts are now rampant on the Twitter platform. Russia's RT Television early on and enthusiastically created a YouTube channel in order to carry its programming, including specially created programming that doesn't run on the television channel, to YouTube viewers around the world. In the process, they became the first news organization to surpass 1 billion views on YouTube. But they did this by gaming, or by riding the algorithm, by deliberately uploading viral videos that they did not own, that they did not produce, that were not their own, but which earned likes and longer watch times, which YouTube's algorithm rewards with better placement among search results and recommendations. Lastly, just this past week, representatives from the 3 companies were called to testify before Congress, and this followed on the heels of the fact that 2 weeks ago, it was reported that lobbyists from the tech industry had begun mobilizing to fend off regulation that would require them to disclose the sources of advertisements they sell and post, just as the United States Senate moved to force them to make such disclosures. Well, why wouldn't they do this? Media companies have always drawn a line of demarcation between editorial content and advertising. Why should social media companies be any different? Meantime, a representative from Facebook added that, and I quote, "With the sheer number of ads on the site, the engineering involved in identifying political ads would be extremely challenging." Wait a second. Did Facebook just admit in saying this that code and algorithms are not the ultimate answer to everything they do? In summary, if this is the media environment that is presently driving our culture-wide discourse about citizenship, our involvement and political activism, and our learning and understanding, then we need first and foremost to understand and to come to terms with it. Perhaps students and scholars of media will have an easier time doing this, but perhaps as genuinely concerned citizens, we can achieve this for ourselves as individuals. But if the industrial forces of Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley, and the machine forces of algorithms and AI, and the netherworld of nefarious practices by malicious manipulators and other actors of sites and services, platforms and programs, they continue to control and thereby dictate and determine the participation and involvement of the greater part of what we know as our political culture, I fear we may be lost in the wilds of this environment that has been constructed for us for some time to come. A quick postscript and I'm done. I want to acknowledge that while I mentioned Tor, and Lance mentioned it for me in my original abstract, I never did bring this up. I never did address it. This was not for a lack of time. This became a conscious decision where, when it came down to it in doing my research and preparing this talk, I simply was not prepared to go there. I have serious ethical reservations about researching and about research in such a digital place. And I think that this is one important avenue for future research. Not for us to go there, but for us to have the conversation, why go there and why not? Thank you very much. And okay, now we're going to bring up the folks who are going to say a little bit about what I've just said. And so our first guest is my old friend, MJ Robinson from Brooklyn College. MJ, thanks.
Tom, thank you. That was spectacular, so thought-provoking, and I'd also like to thank Lance Strate for inviting me to be involved this evening.
Speak up a little bit.
Sure. What I appreciated so much about your talk, Tom, was the way in which you took us on the journey of news gathering, creation, and circulation, from the birth of the printing press to the current day through these lenses of disruption. And the disruption that you first identified was the one that occurred with the printing press in terms of the industrialization of communication. I think the way that this leads to its commodification and makes the creation and distribution of communication text subject to supply-demand economics really is at the heart of what is ultimately the moment we live through now. This shift in focus from what ought to get attention to what would get attention is this great challenge for those of us who seek to teach and to practice the journalism of verification, and also for those who seek to gain knowledge that is helpful or useful, not merely sensational or popular. And of course, as you end talking about what will get attention and how that is now largely driven by what will go viral, what algorithms have determined will go viral, and what will drive the most traffic across advertiser-subsidized social media, toward advertiser-supported sites, or toward politically charged sites designed to shift opinions. I too teach journalism and media studies at a liberal arts institution, and so I know that it's this constant battle to maintain a curriculum that strongly inculcates the responsibility that journalists, as members of the Fourth Estate, have to speak truth to power and to hold those in power accountable to the voters who have put them there. And this is especially difficult in a world that is so dominated by the journalism of affirmation and assertion on cable news channels, and now that has been turned on its head by the primacy of social media as a news distributor. So I especially appreciate the call to arms in your talk, the need for this recognition of the disruptive nature of technologies, their transformational effect upon culture, and our need to question these disruptions and transformations, no matter how killer the app may be. So perhaps one of the more optimistic takes we might explore is this, and I'm going to murder this word, incunabula period of social media. I've never been able to say that going all the way back to media ecology. But, plus side, perhaps this period has just ended, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that word again. Instead, what I'm going to suggest is that if we look at it as saying that the consequences of social media have already taken hold, and that one aspect of them, their ability to transform the political behaviors and actions of an entire country through the manipulation of sharing behaviors, creation of automated accounts, and the targeting of high-volume influencers has already been fully realized. In fact, last night on, yes, MSNBC, an FBI counterterrorism expert noted that the revelation of the ways in which Russia used paid ads, dummy accounts, and sharing strategies on Facebook and Twitter form a type of game plan which can be utilized by large companies wishing to run smaller competitors out of the market, or of course by authoritarian regimes seeking to affect the outcomes of elections in other countries. So, if we look at that, we could say that social media is perhaps not yet mature. It has perhaps moved from the cradle stage into this liminal phase. And here, to borrow a framework from anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, this idea of the liminal. Van Gennep studied the maturation rituals of societies, and he created a taxonomy of the stages of these rituals that involved this sort of separation from the traditions of the society and the family, then a transformation through a set series of activities or actions into a culturally recognized adulthood, and which is then incorporated back into the society. And these rites were crucial for the continued viability and existence, because these rites of passage, with their symbolic representation of death and rebirth, illustrate in a more general way the principles of regenerative renewal required by any society and by any human being. So liminality describes a state of tremendous possibility and revolution, even as it carries within it considerable threat to established orders of hierarchy and control, or the way things have previously been. So we are now clearly in a stage in which the traditional orders and ordering principles of the media industries and media itself are no longer self-evident nor inevitable, if they ever have been. But traditionally, this anxiety and doubt that characterizes the liminal stage can be overcome by shaping the subject, by encouraging it to, through a series of tests, come to reflect on his or herself, to search for a new identity and a new role to take up upon return and reintegration. The self-created crises that the social media companies are currently experiencing and being called to account for requires them to reassess their operating structures, their philosophies, their business strategies, and their algorithms, and to look at their identities as platforms, mediums, communities, and communicators. This creates an opening for intervention in their process by trickster figures who can seek to disrupt the disruptors and intervene in this process, possibly to exploit the differences between perceptions and realities, to remind all that change is the only constant. So, in his book, Trickster Makes This World, as Lewis Hyde heralds the disruptive power of the trickster to innovate and intervene, he doesn't say this explicitly, but in my opinion, Trickster is a general semanticist. That being said, how do we come to terms with this present moment? And how do we disrupt the disruptive innovations of social media, the interactivity that gives authority, ethos, and a sense of scale to the mob, and the advertorial amalgam of so much media content in the absence of traditional editorial gatekeeping and agenda setting by professionals who cleave to the power of the press and the importance of the First Amendment? How do we address the role of AI in the creation of the ecosystem of social media and these content delivery systems that parasitically feed off of social media feeds to algorithmically feed us our next media meal? Thom reminds us of our charge, that our role as media scholars and educators and ecologists is to make the invisible visible, to get the fish to think about the water, and especially when that water may now be vodka flavored. So, to throw a bit of Albert Einstein in here, to try and get out of the same state of mind we were in when we embraced these technologies and apps in such a way that gave them the power and influence that they wielded in our 2016 election. As Thom points out, literacy is hard work, hard won, and not universal. What may be making the mediated public sphere so fraught at the present moment is that one need not be literate in social media to use social media. its use is alarmingly easy and instantly gratifying. Work on hashtag activism has noted that the ease with which one can tweet Je suis Charlie or use the Je suis Charlie app to note one's location on an interactive and ever-updating world map may give one a sufficient enough activist buzz to forestall actual investigation of the reasons behind the attack on Charlie Hebdo in France, or to engage critically with the possibility that such an attack could happen in the US if anti-press sentiment were whipped up to a sufficient fever pitch. 5 years ago, there was much ado about the difference between digital literacy and digital fluency. The Social Lens blog that started it all drew the distinction by saying that digital literacy was knowing how to use digital tools and what to do with them, but having the outcome not always match the intention. Fluency was when one knew when to use the tools to achieve the desired outcome and why the tools would have the desired outcome. So one way of explaining the semantic environment in which the 2016 election played out is that it was a fluency gap between the Americans and the Internet Research Agency, aka the Russian troll farm, that generated the content that up to 150 million Americans saw, shared, and engaged with on Facebook from June 15 to August 17. The Russians were fluent in a way that Americans were not, and they'd figured out how, when, what, and why to circulate their content effectively. But one cannot enforce fluency any more than one can enforce literacy. So while disruptive social media practice have, as Thom says, fed into and fanned the flames of divisiveness, intolerance, and hatred, and they have swelled the tendency toward illiberal and uninformed or badly informed thinking, what we might unfortunately be witnessing, if poll numbers are to be believed, is that there are a fair number of our fellow Americans who are quite happy with the way the disruptions have changed discourse, and the filter bubbles that social media creates are now these sort of safe spaces for that. And they may be echo chambers of anti-democratic, badly informed, and increasingly divisive and partisan thinking. Grabbing a hold of the keys that literacy offers would only counter their worldviews with realities that they don't want to accept. And here we're in Orwell. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. You can't force the happily illiterate influencers to attain skills and competencies that they are not interested in and or do not serve them. And here I find myself going back to Thom's description of his original fascination with music as a mode of communication, which appeared in the NYSGS lecture and the version of this lecture that I read but was not shared tonight. I will now give you the first part of that, glossed, but it was brilliant, it was fabulous. It brought us into this description in a very, this talk in a very interesting way. Thom writes that he was interested in how music as a mode of communication was an invented symbolic system that can be said to be meaningful. The two questions that activated the curiosity that Thom took through first a traditional media studies master's and then the Postman-Nystrom-Moran media ecology PhD were, what exactly is this brand of meaning that music creates, and what transpires across the chasm between us when one plays or listens to music? I get that roughly right. Verbatim. Perhaps these questions can help us think about social media, especially if we complicate them with the consideration of literacy. What brand of meaning is created by these networked, interactive, instantaneous, global, unregulated, AI-driven, mobile, and ubiquitous platforms of communication? What transpires across the chasms between social media users as they post, share, like, comment, tag, flame, and name check in a virtual space that has eroded the role of the Fourth Estate in providing shared and agreed upon facts? And what disruptions can we, as scholars, educators, activists, or concerned citizens, make to disrupt the disruptions wrought by these new media? These may be jumping off points for a conversation later tonight, but first I would like to hand the podium off to Mike Plugh. Thank you.
Thank you, MJ. It's a difficult act to follow those thoughtful, beautiful ideas, Thom's talk, of course, and then to go before Lance, but I will do my best to say something useful and hopefully interesting to you tonight. At the beginning, Lance promised you that the three of us would provide some reflections on Thom's talk. And I think what I'll begin with, rather than reflections, are echoes to play on Lance's, the title of Lance's first book. Maybe I'll get to some reflections after that. Because Thom and I share an intellectual genealogy, it's perhaps not surprising that I agree with him on most of his points, that we share a similar point of view, and that point of view comes from a number of similar scholars. In his talk, I heard echoes of Jacques Ellul, echoes of Lewis Mumford, and of course echoes of Neil Postman. It was done artfully, beautifully, and in the same vein as those wonderful thinkers. I think there's a particular area of that tradition that I'd like to concentrate on at the beginning of my remarks. In the substance of the talk, Thom talks about power. He talks about authoritarianism and the rise of political authoritarianism. When I was preparing to talk about his lecture, I pulled out a favorite of mine from an echo of the past. This is a piece published in Technology and Culture by Lewis Mumford in 1964, which is entitled Authoritarian and Democratic Techniques. It mirrors some of the thinking that he presents in the Pentagon of Power. And in a moment, if you'll indulge me, I will read directly from this, because I think there's some things in this piece that, that are important in the context of the way Thom talked about technology, about authoritarianism, and indeed about democracy. Each of the historical disruptions that Thom talked about in his talk had distinct characteristics. And I'm interested in putting those distinct characteristics aside for a moment to talk about an overarching kind of disruption that perhaps begins with the printing press, although maybe if we flesh this out a bit together, we could find roots of it at an earlier period. The idea that technology plays a role in an underlying DNA of our culture, that it affects the character of our culture in a way that defies any of the individual disruptions. In this case, it's a disruption of scale. And Mumford is really, in this piece, interested in a disruption of scale. The idea that throughout human history, we've managed to conduct our affairs on a small scale, which he calls the democratic scale, where small groups of people, intimate with one another, familiar with one another on a personal level, were able to come together to solve problems and deal with needs and hopes and desires through interpersonal communication. And that it's these technologies that scaled up our relationships with other human beings that ended up becoming most disruptive. That from a democratic techniques, he describes an authoritarian techniques. However, we describe the political authoritarianism that's been on the rise over the last century, say. We can talk about a technological authoritarianism that has removed us or abstracted us further and further from our individual relationships, from our partnerships with people who we know and love, people who live geographically close to us. And I think this is perhaps the key to understanding why each of these subsequent disruptions has vexed us and has produced what media ecologists are concerned with in terms of the negative effects of technological disruption. We no longer have control over our lives in the way we once did. We've trusted distant authorities because we can, because they're able to concentrate power. We can talk about these in Marxist terms. We can talk about these, as many grad students like to do, they talk about these in terms of Foucault's power. But as media ecologists, we talk about them in terms of technology. And I'd like to read just a little bit about what Mumford has to say about this situation. He says, "The inventors of nuclear bombs, space rockets, and computers are the pyramid builders of our own age. psychologically inflated by a similar myth of unqualified power, boasting through their science of their increasing omnipotence, if not omniscience, moved by obsessions and compulsions no less irrational than those of earlier absolute systems, particularly the notion that the system itself must be expanded at whatever eventual cost to life. Through mechanization, automation, cybernetic direction, this authoritarian technique has at last successfully overcome its most serious weakness, its original dependence on resistant, sometimes actively disobedient servo mechanisms, still human enough to harbor purposes that do not always coincide with those of the system. And it strikes me that as we've trusted these more distant authorities through knowledge created by newspapers, by the printing press, and indeed by electronic communication and digital communication, that we've increasingly surrendered our own authority over our lives to a distant authority that we no longer recognize in ourselves. He argues the center of authority in this new system is no longer a visible personality, an all-powerful king. Even in totalitarian dictatorships, the center now lies in the system itself, invisible but omnipresent. All its human components, even the technical and managerial elite, even in the sacred priesthood of science, who alone have access to the secret knowledge by means of which total control is now swiftly being effected, are themselves trapped by the very perfection of the organization they invented. Like the pharaohs of the Pyramid Age, these servants of the system identify its goods with their own kind of well-being. As with the divine king, their praise of the system is an act of self-worship. And again, like the king, they are in the grip of an irrational compulsion to extend their means of control and expand the scope of their authority. In this new system-centered collective, the Pentagon of power, there is no visible presence who issues commands. Unlike Job's God, the new deities cannot be confronted, still less defied. Under the pretext of saving labor, the ultimate end of this technique is to displace life, or rather to transfer the attributes of life to the machine and the mechanical collective, allowing only so much of the organism to remain as may be controlled and manipulated. And this speaks, I think, really to the darknet situation that we're in, is that the more we feed our own data into the system that governs all our affairs, our banking and our politics and our education, we increasingly surrender whatever personality there was in relationships and leadership and so forth to a system that frankly has grown beyond the control of the people like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and many of the people Thom mentioned in his talk. What are we to do about this? I'm going to read one more passage from this and then I'll move on to my reflections and get out of your way. Why has our age surrendered so easily to the controllers, the manipulators, the conditioners of an authoritarian techniques? The answer to this question is both paradoxical and iconic. Present-day techniques differ from that of the overtly brutal, half-baked authoritarian systems of the past in the one highly favorable particular. It has accepted the basic principle of democracy, that every member of society should have a share in its goods. By progressively fulfilling this part of the democratic promise, our system has achieved a hold over the whole community that threatens to wipe out every other vestige of democracy. The bargain we are being asked to ratify takes the form of a magnificent bribe. Under the democratic authoritarian social contract, each member of the community may claim every material advantage, every intellectual and emotional stimulus he may desire, in quantities hardly available hitherto even for a restricted minority. Food, housing, swift transportation like Uber, instantaneous communication like social media, medical care, entertainment, education, but on one condition, that one must not merely ask for nothing that the system does not provide, but likewise agree to take everything offered, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized in the precise quantities that the system, rather than the person, requires. I'd like to stop there for a second. I think this is a particularly dark vision of the mechanical age and certainly the digital age. In that way, it reflects, I think, some of the tone that Thom tried to convey to us in our fears about democracy and our fears about interpersonal relations and so on. And I'd like to suddenly put on a media ecology hat to propose the question, what if there's lots of good in this system as well? Now, as I mentioned, I share most of Tom's sensibilities about this, and so I'm playing a little bit of a game with you. But we could argue that voices that were never heard before are suddenly heard. People on the margins of our societies who have been penalized for not sharing whatever particular characteristics were the dominant characteristics of those in power now have access to a public square. People live in a state of abundance that has fended off hunger and I mean, we still live, unfortunately, with terrible poverty, but I don't think anyone would argue that the society we live in today is plagued in the same way as humans have been plagued throughout history with these things. We've made significant progress. Technology's been a part of it. The main issue is that we're not going to escape living with it. And therefore, we have to consider, in the media ecological sense, what's positive and what's negative about these disruptions, about these changes, in comparison to what? I think in Neil Postman's work we see that his concerns and his critiques were negative in comparison to an era of high literacy, and an era where people were actively engaged in democracy, that people understood the affairs of the day, even if some of that is a convenient myth. In comparison to what? In comparison to what? And my last reflection is maybe a set of questions and one proposition that maybe Thom will be kind enough to address when he returns. If we're so concerned about democracy and what's going to happen to democracy, why is it that we don't practice democracy in the places where we hold our most important business? Why are our schools not more democratic? Why aren't our workplaces more democratic? If we expect to practice democracy well, and if we care about it so much that we've elevated the idea of democracy to a religion, why is it that we can't govern our affairs through democracy? Whatever the negative effects of these technologies have had over the years, and whatever the positive effects of things like literacy and the printing press have had, we can mine them in a way, I think, that will retrieve the sentiment that was important to us in governing our affairs and creating better relationships with people. If we learn to practice democracy by practicing democracy, I think there may be some hope. In fact, I think that's what Mumford is stabbing at in this piece. And my one proposition, which maybe is a darker way to end this, is that Thom remarked that all technologies are disruptive and that they change everything, which certainly has been a conundrum for people in the past. They've represented opportunity and crisis, these disruptions. But most of the time, these disruptions have taken place over a rather long period of time. Whatever the immediate schism is, the effects of these schisms take long periods of time to be fully realized. And I think the characteristic of our current environment is a state of constant disruption, is that we've begun to evolve in a technological way that no human beings have ever been forced to confront. And it strikes me that our conundrum is one of constant disruption. Disruption itself is the issue for us now. Not a particular disruption, but what do we do if our culture no longer stands still for us to cope with it? And with that, I'd like to bring Lance Strate up to give his remarks, and hope maybe Thom will address a couple of the things that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Go get my gold spot.
Well, it's great to have heard Thom talk again, and really wonderful to have MJ and Mike's responses as well. I'm so glad we were able to do this, and I'll just add a few things to it. I mean, the theme of disruption is, of course, certainly a very contemporary one. I can't help but think of the series, the HBO series Silicon Valley, where they go out to a special, like, I guess, venture capitalist presentation, all these startups or potential startups, and it's called Disrupt. You know, that is the name of the game. And it really makes me think, I mean, there's a wonderful line in the book by Harold Innis, The Bias of Communication, where he says, sudden extensions of communication are reflected in cultural disturbances. And in a way, it's a very modest kind of statement, but also very emphatic, that when we extend our ability to communicate, we are disturbing the existing relations in a society and a culture. And that's a little bit more modest than disrupt, disturbance. But it's along the same idea of disruption, of break. This applies to technology generally, and you know, I think of the movie, I just showed the beginning to my media ecology class, the first 15 minutes of The Gods Must Be Crazy, where a Coke bottle is dropped into a tribe of Kalahari Bushmen and completely disrupts their way of life. That they've never had anything like this before, and finally they decide to get rid of it. If you haven't seen this movie, you should. It is both very insightful about technology, and the beginning of it has a wonderful kind of comparison discussion about the tribe's ability to adapt to their environment as opposed to so-called civilized human beings not being willing to adapt to their environment, and so creating an environment that is so complex that we have to go to school for years and years to learn how to survive in it, and that we have to constantly adapt and readapt ourselves to that environment. So that, and Mike's point is, you know, very well put, you know, that we live in constant disruption. So I think this is true of technology in general, but especially true of communication technology. Language communication was central to Korzybski in his understanding of human progress, of time, of the basis of time binding, our ability to make progress, to pass knowledge on, preserve knowledge, and pass it on from generation to generation. It's rooted in language. It's amplified by writing, that we can do this, and this is central to his project in general semantics and science and sanity, is to improve our ability to communicate. Improve that language is a tool and it can be refined. The tool itself can be refined, and our ability to use it can be refined. And I think it's certainly the point. We live in this period of time, and McLuhan, back in his first book, The Mechanical Bride, and he referred to how our time is full of discontinuities, and he pointed to James Joyce and Pablo Picasso and the newspaper front page. You know, that we suddenly find, and Thom spoke so much about newspapers, and it's really after the Telegraph that the newspaper front page turns into, and McLuhan styled it, a mosaic. Right, that it is discontinuous in the sense that it's not like a book where you read where it goes from beginning to middle to end. It's these different articles all slapped together in no particular order, and the articles even are continued. You know, it's like you read the first column and it says continued on page 3. Do you go to page 3 or do you read the next column? I always read the next column. But you know, there's no there's no clear pathway to it. It really is a precursor of the website. It is. And while newspapers, we think of them as print media, it's with the telegraphic communication behind them. There's simply an interface to electronic communications. Of course, Postman later referred to television, and it's particularly true of commercial television, as discontinuous. Right? And it's like we think we watch a program, but we really don't. You know, we watch, you know, you turn on and there are like a series of commercials that have nothing to do with each other. And then there's, let's say, the opening of the program, and then they go to that like whatever opening music and title sequence that they show every episode that has nothing to do with the narrative of the program. And then maybe they show a little of the narrative, and then it stops, and we get a series of unrelated commercial breaks and spots, and then another fragment of the narrative. I mean, it is actually a discontinuous experience, and even if you're watching other things, we're still sort of zapping through channels with our remotes now, and that's even more discontinuous. So, I mean, it's very much part of our media environment, and the same is true of clicking through different websites from link to link to link. Back at the end of the 60s, Peter Drucker, another person we include as a media ecology scholar and the founder of management studies in the business schools, wrote a book called The Age of Discontinuity, and you know that this is, you know, our era is characterized by discontinuity. For McLuhan, continuity was a characteristic of literacy, of the alphabet, of things moving in line from A to B to C, of Aristotelian thinking, you know, that general semantics is critical of, and of print. But this 20th century and now into the 21st is the age of discontinuity. So we're talking about change, and I also think of Alvin Toffler and future shock. Again, I think that was 1970, but you know, what Alvin Toffler says in Future Shock is not just that things are changing all the time, but that the rate of change is changing. You know, that change accelerates. And I mean, his view is we just have to live with it, we have to accept it, and we have to learn how to cope with it. We have to change our educational system to cope with it. He didn't seem to really consider the fact that we might crash and burn, or even that we might just say, let's stop for a bit. But I also want to mention on another side, Paul Watzlawick, who comes out of systems theory, out of Gregory Bateson's, really a popularizer of Gregory Bateson. And you know, and that sort of line of thinking also follows through from general semantics. General semantics is a precursor of systems theory. Wrote a wonderful book called Change: Principles of Problem Formation and Problem Resolution. Now, as a psychotherapist, Watzlawick was concerned with the problem of achieving change, that so often we're in situations where we need change and we don't get that. We're in need of that disruption. And he points out there are two kinds of changes that can occur. There are changes within a system and changes to the system. And he uses the analogy of mathematics. You can have change that doesn't change the system. When you say add 0, you're doing something, the result is no difference. Or when you multiply by 1. And it's like the kind of effort when two people are pushing against each other to form perfect stasis. That is a kind of change that's going on that results in no change. In some ways, we'd also talk about homeostasis, and that's the need to keep balance, to keep an equilibrium for dynamic systems, such as living systems, organisms, ecosystems. You have to constantly change to adjust to a dynamic environment. So, of course, change itself is not necessarily a bad thing, and the problem is knowing when it's appropriate to make a change within the system, and when is it appropriate to change the system in its entirety, you know, to step outside. And that is the problem. I mean, for Postman, and his view was that media changes, those sudden extensions of communication, tend to be changes to the entire system. And I think we can see that because communication is not just part of the system, among many other parts, communication is sort of the connective tissue of the system. It's what holds the system together. So when you change the pathways of communication, the modes of communication, you really are changing, in a sense, the underlying strata, the binding force of the system itself. And Postman poses the problem, or the question, to what problem is this a solution when we think of technology, which is really derived from the traditional debater's criteria. The debater, in debate, the person who advocates for change has to prove there is a problem, there's a problem, there's a need for change, there are solutions, and this solution is the appropriate one, the best one to solve the problem. And of course, that's not what happens a lot of the times. I mean, that we don't get this kind of justification. We just sort of embrace change for change's sake. There are times when change is necessary. The Civil War is a great example of that, right? I mean, it was necessary. I mean, this has been such a important topic in recent discourse, and such absurd statements being said about it. It absolutely was necessary to get rid of slavery. It was insane that we had such a system that was being justified, and that and that was any idea that should be defended. Change is necessary. The Nazi Germany needed to be bumped up, right? I think, I look back on ancient Mexico and the way they engaged. They had the ball game, and I think it was the winning team that would be sacrificed to the gods. Right? That needed to be eliminated, right? It's the same. If you look to the Bible, I mean, what some of you call the Old Testament, and some of us call the nonfiction section of the Bible. Just kidding. But there is this very strong polemic against human sacrifice. That there were cultures where they sacrificed children to the gods. That change is needed. And I go along with them in Walter Ong, who says human consciousness evolves. And through many of these improvements, we have moved further along. I think our society today has much more. I think of what life was like when I grew up, right? I mean, we had apartheid in the sense of there were neighborhoods where African Americans couldn't live. I mean, there were neighborhoods where Jews and Catholics still weren't welcome, and of course clubs, and women were not anywhere near open to in the workplace. And we find continually new freedoms and new problems to solve. So the question is, what is appropriate, and what can we change? What do we need to change? And when is change just sort of for its own sake and disruption that is not useful? I think this is where general semantics does come in, because general semantics is all about evaluation, and we need to just take a very clear look at, what is important? What are we talking about here? I mean, part of it in general semantics, as has been said, is critical of the either-or mentality, the two-valued orientation. Right? Do we adopt it or not adopt it? Really, the question is, when's the good time to use this technology, and when isn't? Right? What is the appropriate use? It's not either or. And the map and the territory. We say this innovation, this technology is going to do this. That's the map. What it actually does is the territory, and we need to know that what we say it's going to do is not necessarily what it's going to do. We have to be aware of that, and that it's not what we think it's going to be. So we have to be reflective. That's general semantics says, stop for a minute. Take a moment to think things over. And that's the rush to disrupt works completely against that. It says, don't stop, go, disrupt, disrupt, disrupt. Let's add, what are we disrupting? What do we want to disrupt, and what do we want to keep? I mean, that's the essence of time binding, and that's what we need to think is, this is reflection, that idea that the world is constantly changing as it is. We need to take that into account, and I need to think, how are we going to respond to those changes, and what changes shall we initiate, and what should we not? And of course, this is a tall order, and it's probably falling on deaf ears. It's certainly not something that Silicon Valley wants to hear about. But until we do that, and it may take some major catastrophe before we get to that point, but until we do that, we are leaving ourselves open to disruption that may ultimately be catastrophic. That's, I think of Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five, and he was very critical. He was joking around when he had these aliens who say, we see time as all one thing, and you can't change the future, and we know in the future we're going to invent a device that will destroy the universe, right? And his main character says, well, why don't you just not do it? And it says, we've always done it. It's always happened. Time is like the Rocky Mountains. But the important point is that, I mean, and people read this and they take it seriously, but Vonnegut was a satirist, and he was basically saying, bullshit. We can't say, let's not do it. And we have to say, let's not do it, or we won't be here. I want to thank you all. I'm very happy to turn it over to Thom, who can hear if he has any responses to what we've said, and especially for a question and answer session with you all. Thanks.
Well, I mean, I want to say this, that as an academic, I'm used to going to conferences and talking for 12 minutes, and I just want to thank you all for your patience and your politeness in listening to what, for me, was, you know, a rather long talk. And so I'd rather just open this to the floor at this point and have a conversation than talk in response to what were actually really, you know, thank you, very thoughtful remarks, and I appreciate the three of you, you know, reading my work, and Lance having listened to 3 versions of it and reading it. But yeah, questions. Let's have a conversation. Terry, yeah.
I'm thinking of each of these categories that were addressed by people that spoke. Your presentation talked about the economics, the powers, the binary either or. And then when Mike brought up why can't we be more democratic, what popped into my mind is, prior to all of this, most of our systems are bureaucratic and hierarchical. They are not democratic. And those systems are operating within all of these economic systems. And so getting to Lance's point, first order change would be within the system, second order change would be outside, trying to address it. So we have multi-layers of problems there. There's an economic system, every one of them is also bureaucratic. There's power struggles within those. So how one even frames these problems is a challenge. So I just wanted to say, I can see how all of these things dovetail with each other and create complexity that's very complex.
Is that a question?
No, it's a comment.
I mean, a comment in reverse is, you know, that Mike made very quickly a remark about graduate students citing Foucault. But, you know, Foucault was right.
Yeah.
That the world is very much about power, and here we are in this room with, you know, 20, 25 people talking about all of these things, but we have no power to bring about change. We can converse about it, and you know, we can say things that we hope for and things that we believe in, but you know, it's a very nice library. The wine and cheese was very nice, but nothing is going to come of this.
Well, Henry Perkinson said ideas make change.
Well, yeah, you know. Yeah, yeah.
Well, the whole thing is about communication.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that these media things have become so popular because people want to communicate. with people who are very far away or strangers, just anybody.
Sure.
That's how language developed, with people wanting to share stuff. So
Sure.
you can't beat that with anything. I mean, that's really the crux of it.
You know, and so, you know, Mark Zuckerberg says that what he created was all about community, and that's what he wants it to be. Well, you know, when Morse invented the telegraph, he didn't say it. He asked a question. He said, "What has God wrought? What has God brought about?" Right? When Bell invented telephonic communication, and they created out of this the AT&T, the idea at first with telephonic communication was you dial up and you listen to music, right? So with respect to Mark Zuckerberg having any idea that this would be a means to create community in ways that would be beneficial to all of us is hubris and folly. And you know, one of the articles that came up in the course of my finishing the talk that I gave at NYSGS, and was in the New York Times, was Facebook's Frankenstein moment, that they have created a monster that they can no longer control, and it has gone rogue. And the fact is that it's gone rogue because it's not the platform, but it's the ways in which people are using it. And they step back and they say, well, we can't control and we can't censor, and you know, that's not what we do. We're a platform. We're not, you know, the CBS doing the CBS News. We're not content creators. You are. Yeah.
When we look at biological systems and we discuss the word evolution, we can argue that a disruption does take place based on the pre-existing entities and systems that are disrupted and kind of naturally selected out of the equation. How do we differentiate evolution in social systems from disruptions? Because I find the word disruption too prejudiced. Because I think it's a lot more esoteric. I think there's a lot more specificity to the actual modification, the social modification that you referred to. Would you possibly consider another word rather than disruption?
What I consider? Interesting question. I mean, I used it as a hinge to talk about the things that I wanted to talk about because they are using it. You know, again, the original concept comes from some folks at the Harvard School of Business, running the MBA program at the Harvard School of Business, that says that in a world where, you know, when I remarked in passing about us all being entrepreneurs, the idea is that there are so many people in the world right now who need not just to make a living and have what is not a living wage or just a living wage, but they're all clamoring for the kind of success that can bring them the spoils that they see through their media culture around them, right? So we all kind of have, and I think I use the term, these extravagant expectations and ambitions, at least hopes. And so it's in that clamoring that this idea of disruption in industry came about. You can build a company and create great wealth for yourself and your shareholders if you just find a way to everything up, or up a part of an existing industry. Why do taxi cabs need to be pushed out of the way in New York City in favor of this new means of getting a ride, right? So I just borrowed the word. I'm not wedded to the word so much, but I mean, I'd like to hear more about what you're saying about evolution and social systems.
I think Lance is your name, correct? You touched on the Mexican football team, or the Amazonian football team, whichever it was. Aztec. Sorry, excuse me. Who was disrupted by that disruption? Like, you know, the winning team being sacrificed. There'll always be a winner and a loser anytime there's any sort of entropic movement towards a direction. The question is the utility and the social pertinence.
But the people who were disrupted were the people who were
Who
sacrificed.
didn't,
Yeah,
right,
they
who
were
didn't,
Yeah.
well, they might have benefited from it, but immediately were disrupted by it.
Well, that's a pretty extreme form of, yeah, that's good.
Well, I mean, I would just say that what I was saying was that was a culture that needed to be disrupted.
Right, I understood what you
Yeah.
said, but that's also a good an example. in what I'm
But I
trying-
think, just on your point, the other word is chaos. And that is, comes out of chaos theory, and it was embraced by the same basic kind of group of people back in the 90s who were talking about the wondrous effects of digital media and took from chaos theory the idea of keeping on the edge of chaos, and this metaphor of surfing or skateboarding or whatever, but just sort of balancing on that edge. But chaos, in terms of systems theory, is what you point to. You add a little bit of chaos, and you disrupt the system. It can then reconfigure itself at a higher level of complexity. That's evolution, or a form of evolution. But the problem is that it's only up to a certain point. Too much chaos, and the system crashes.
Would you consider, I wasn't referring to chaos, and randomness is a slightly different term.
Well, but they're synonyms, and that's...
But I think
mutation is the word.
the
Well, that's a
use
form of chaos.
disruption, as in an evolutionary progression forward that has some utility, as in it survived, it caused a change, is by nature going to usurp certain mechanisms. Do we all agree on that? And this usurpation is the losing team. That's why I used the Aztec example.
Right.
And I was just curious. I think disruption prejudices the matter because it gives forth this idea that it's not necessarily benevolent. And most of the disruptions you mentioned were very benevolent for whatever reason at the time, and socially pertinent at the time. I'm not trying to make a point. I'm just bringing it up as a counter.
I don't necessarily think so. When I think it was Mike who, in his response, brought up print literacy and the idea of that we are now in a post-literate age, that we are a post-literate culture, and certainly as I look at my students, that's even brought into even sharper relief. That I'm coming from a point of view of privileging print literacy and hoping that we can somehow preserve it as important in our that's media ecology, right? As part of our balance of use of media, not leave it in the dustbin of history. And so when I'm talking about news practices, journalistic practice, and talking about how it serves a representative democracy, I think that when television comes along, I don't want to make the argument that we're de-evolving, but we reached a crisis point, and that what happened, well, what has happened since 2006, but maybe has come to a head as of very recently, has made that worse. That with respect to winners and losers, and to go back to Terry's point, again, aren't we all in this together? And why do there have to be winners and losers? Why is that the measure of evolution when this species has become the dominant species on the planet, and we have the ability, like Lance said, to say, no, we're not going to have winners and losers anymore. Everybody is going to win, at least to some extent, if we can help it. Yeah?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to my mind, one of the things, and I share many of your concerns regarding the potential dark side of technology, while at the same time there's a very bright side of technology too. It's like any other tool. You can bash somebody in the head with a hammer, or you can bash a nail with a hammer. It works both ways. But one of the key things that I think has to be remembered as we go through technological change is that there are archaic institutions and structures that interact with that technological change. We didn't lose this election because the majority of people voted for Donald Trump. We lost the election because of an archaic system called the Electoral College.
Who's we?
The American people, as far as I'm concerned, who voted for.
I'm sorry, you're not speaking for me.
No,
Okay, I just wanted to know.
No, I'm speaking for the
Thanks,
majority of
yeah.
I'm speaking for the majority of American people
No, you're
who
not.
actually
You're not.
voted.
You're
Yes,
not.
yes, 50%
That's your
voted for
assumption
Clinton,
and your assumption.
47%
Okay,
You
okay.
can
well-
assert whatever you like. Okay. That's the underlying subliminal content of this whole discussion is the disruption, the great disruption that happened as a result of all the disruption was Donald Trump. Isn't that the underlying
Well-
statement? Isn't that really what we're getting at here?
Well, maybe we should
No,
let
I'm
him.
asking the
No,
question.
but maybe we. I mean, he was called
Well, I
on.
asked him who's we.
Yeah,
He
but
says,
I mean-
we, the American
Yeah, but
people.
he was called
lost.
on, and you're
I didn't feel
you're
like I was.
interrupting. You're
Excuse me.
disrupting. You're
That's
disrupting.
right, and that's why Donald Trump won, because I disrupted.
Okay.
And people like me disrupted.
Okay.
And you have
Can
to
we-
accept that.
Well, no, I don't.
Yeah, well, it happens. It's reality.
Right, right, but you're-
But when you say we, excuse me, Mr. Hamilton created the Electoral College. The Electoral College is not archaic.
Yes, it
It's
is.
extremely useful.
Yeah, it's useful for people like you.
No, it's useful.
At that time.
It's useful in the sense that it stops one region of the country dictating to the rest of the entire country.
Timing is everything in life. At that time, it was the thing to do.
For
Now
you.
it's not.
For you. That's
For
your
us,
opinion.
all of us.
That's your opinion. But guess what? It's
Okay,
still part of the
listen.
law.
You have to stop now.
Why not?
Why not? You have to stop
Yes,
now.
why not?
Because you weren't called on, and
Yeah,
we're
but-
trying to be
but the fact
orderly.
is that-
No, you have to stop
Okay,
now and let
fine.
others
All right.
speak.
But it's not right to make statements on the behalf of the whole.
We heard you.
If you're not.
We heard you.
Wait, but you made a statement
not
that
right.
said the entire subtext of my talk was about Donald Trump winning the election, and
it
the
wasn't.
entire
I said that
subtext of
because
my
he
talk.
said we lost
No,
the
but you said it
election.
to me. You said the entire
All right,
subtext
so
of my
I
talk,
should've
which
said
was
it to
about
him.
media.
Okay.
Okay. So what? Back to your question.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that when you're looking at periods of technological change, you also have to look at archaic structures that underpin that technological change and that also have to be dealt with, and that also affect the technologies that are going on at that period of time. Because there are certain types of things. Gerrymandering is a good example of it. Gerrymandering again is an archaic structure within the democratic process that can be manipulated by technology, by technological change, by media change, by the way that opinions can be changed or can be manipulated, and yet remain as a means, as what is essentially an undemocratic reflection of the voting public.
I mean, the things that you're talking about, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, are technologies, no doubt, right? They're inventions. As a person who is more fixated on communication technologies, I don't know what I can say in response to that, other than to go back to where we were before. And I hate to sound, I hope that my talk wasn't entirely pessimistic and negative. But Terry, bringing me back to Foucault, with respect to power, this conversation is taking place within a world in which power shapes discourse as much as reason. And what do we do with that? What do we do about that?
I have one quick comment. I think MJ's notion of maybe we're in a liminal space is very optimistic and positive, and maybe
That's
that, just by talking about it, we can identify things and self-critique and so on as a society. And so I found that, hopeful.
Because inside disruption is rupture, which is rapture, and the aperture. So we have this sort of liminal space and the rapturousness of that rupture,
Right.
which brings back the positive.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Now he's just
By the way, Speaking of Blu-rays, I presented your band at Kenny's Castaways many years ago, and I probably in my video archives still have your tape, which you never came back for. Just like you know.
No, actually, we do have at least one, if not a couple of. You shot the camera up above the stage from the back?
That's correct.
Oh, what's your name?
Well, I was known as Aristides Duval at that time.
Nice.
I'm now known as
Who are
Mr.
you
Melody.
now?
Nice.
I'm so sorry.
Mr. Melody,
I'm so
TM.
sorry that I didn't recognize you.
That's okay. I didn't recognize you either. But when you said Blu-ray,
I certainly read your name, and I'm so sad that the club no longer exists, along with all of the rest of that world.
he died about 5 years ago.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, great memories. Wow. Yes, Ben.
I'd like to make a stab at trying to connect your thoughts and Tom's thoughts. I may have misunderstood. You were talking about evolution, and could perhaps disruption just be thought of not as something, not judging the behavior that's going on, and just seeing it overall generically as maybe an evolution?
If we accept evolution as being, and I'm going to use chaos language, orderly, as in heading towards some sort of outcome that's favorable to life, which is order. Disruption is contrary to that, as in it gives you this idea of winners and losers. And I believe the way you were referring to it was that there was an evolutionary forward, and by disrupting, there was a chaotic destruction of systems around it. And I was just trying to get a clarification.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I don't think I can actually bridge the two thoughts. What I was thinking you meant was that it does calling the behavior within the system disruption, casting a judgment on it when perhaps it should not be judged negatively, and maybe it's just evolution, maybe passively naturally selected. I thought that's what you might be saying.
Well, I referred to the word disruption, and I started the conversation with that, and I said disruption maybe was misrepresentative of an evolutionary progress.
One last thought about that, though, is that the word is disruption, D-I-S. It's not D-Y-S, as in something negative. Not that really makes much difference or sense, but...
Well,
Yeah.
this is a this.
There's a difference
This
between
and that and the
progress
other thing.
evolution.
I actually do have a response to that with respect to talking about not human evolution, but the evolution, the possibility that our tools have taken on an evolution of their own. And I'm not going to...
Social, technological evolution.
Right.
Well, yeah, and I'm not going to throw Kurzweil and the singularity out at you, but I'm going to say this so I just became, or I will be soon, the new editor of Etc. And one of the things that we're going to do for the 75th anniversary of Etc. is we're going to put together a double issue that is going to be a compendium of a bunch of the really important and influential articles that have been published in the journal over the 75 years. And as I started thinking about doing this, I was talking about it with Marty, I was talking about it with Lance. The first article that came to mind is an article by Christine Nystrom, who was our professor back at NYU, and it's entitled Literacy as Deviance.
Deviance?
Literacy as Deviance. And if I can cut to the chase on this one, if I can try to...
Which you can also get off the New York Society website. You can download it there.
It was one of the most influential articles on my thinking. She says that literacy is, I don't know if she said an anachronism, but that we became literate in order to invent the technologies that we have invented, and again, in particular communication technologies, and that there is a teleology, a sense that these are going somewhere. And where she says they're going is that it's always been about a history of telling stories. That we started out, life is our story, but then we tell stories to one another, and we make them up, and we make up fictional stories, and then we started writing them down, and then we started printing them and we created literature, and then we started showing them to people on a flat screen where it's more of an analog of real life, and you see the person rather than black marks on a page that you imagine what the person looks like and what the setting is. And now we have virtual reality technology, which suggests that in terms of entertainment, why are we sitting in a darkened theater looking at this screen? Let's be immersed in our entertainments and be able to interact with them. And she didn't really know about virtual reality technology at the time. She was talking about holography as a way toward this. But what she was talking about is that eventually what we're trying to do with these technologies is to play God. If I can immerse myself in my entertainments and live within them, what if I can then say, forget about my life as I was born into it and what my station is. Let me make my life into what I want it to be and control it as though I am my own God.
I think that's a good note to end on.
Thank you all.
So thank you to Thom. Our next New York Society meeting will be on Wednesday, December 6th, and the theme will be play, learning, and language. So play, learning, and language. So be there or be square.
Mm-hmm.